Museveni was born on September 15, 1944 to parents Amos cattle keeper, and Estiri, 1918 to 2001, he is an ethnic Hima. Museveni's father, Amos, was a soldier in World War II. Museveni attended elementary school, Mbarara High School, for his primary and secondary education. He attended the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania for his tertiary education, where he studied economics and political science. The university at the time was a hotbed of radical Pan-African and Marxist political thought. While at university, he formed the University Students' African Revolutionary Front student activist group and led a student delegation to Frelimo-held territory in Portuguese Mozambique where they received military training. Toppling of Amin. In October 1978, Ugandan troops invaded the Kagera salient in northern Tanzania, initiating the Uganda-Tanzania War. Tanzanian President Julius ordered the Tanzania People's Defense Force, TPDF, to counterattack and mobilize Ugandan dissidents to fight Amin's regime. Museveni was pleased by this development. In December 1978 Julius attached Museveni and his forces to Tanzanian troops under Brigadier Silas Museveni, and his Freneza troops subsequently accompanied the Tanzanians during the counter-invasion of Uganda. He was present during the capture and destruction of Mbarara in February 1979, and involved in the Western Uganda Campaign of 1979. In course of these operations, he alternatively spent time at the front lines and in Tanzania where he discussed the cooperation of various anti-Amin rebel groups as well as the political future of Uganda with Tanzanian politicians and other Ugandan opposition figures such as Obote. He played a significant part in the Moshi Conference which led to the unification of the opposition as the Uganda National Liberation Front, UNLF. 1980 to 1986, Ugandan Bush War. With the overthrow of Amin in 1979 and the contested election that returned Milton Obote to power in 1980, Museveni returned to Uganda with his supporters to gather strength in their rural strongholds in the Bantu-dominated south and southwest to form the Popular Resistance Army, PRA. They planned a rebellion against the Second Obote regime and its armed forces, the Uganda National Liberation Army, UNLA. The insurgency began with an attack on an army installation in the Central District on February 6, 1981. The party later merged with former President Yusufu fighting group, the Uganda Freedom Fighters, to create the National Resistance Army, NRA, with its political wing, the National Resistance Movement, NRM. Two other rebel groups, the Uganda National Rescue Front, UNRF, and the former Uganda National Army, FUNA, engaged Obote's forces. The FUNA was formed in the West Nile sub-region from the remnants of Amin's supporters. The NRA/NRM developed a 10-point program for an eventual government. The Central Intelligence Agency's World Factbook estimates that the Obote regime was responsible for more than 100,000 civilian deaths across Uganda. 1985 Nairobi Agreement. On July 27, 1985, factionalism within the Uganda People's Congress government led to a successful military coup against Obote by his former army commander, Lieutenant General Tito Museveni, and the NRM/NRA were angry that the revolution for which they had fought for 4 years had been hijacked by the UNLA, which they viewed as having been discredited by gross human rights violations during Obote II. Despite these reservations, however, the NRM/NRA eventually agreed to peace talks presided over by a Kenyan delegation headed by President Daniel Arap Moi. The talks, which lasted from August 26 to December 17, were notoriously acrimonious and the resultant ceasefire broke down almost immediately. The final agreement, signed in Nairobi, called for a ceasefire, demilitarization of Kampala, integration of the NRA and government forces, and absorption of the NRA leadership into the military council. These conditions were never met. Battle of Kampala. On January 20, 1986, several hundred troops loyal to Amin were accompanied into Ugandan territory by the Zaire military. The forces intervened following a secret training in Zaire and an appeal from Okolo 10 days previously. By January 22, government troops in Kampala had begun to quit their posts en masse as the rebels gained ground from the south and southwest. Museveni was sworn in as president on January 29. "This is not a mere change of guard, it is a fundamental change," said Museveni, after a ceremony conducted by British-born Chief Justice Peter Allen. Speaking to crowds of thousands outside the Ugandan parliament, Museveni promised a return to democracy. "The people of Africa, the people of Uganda, are entitled to a democratic government. It is not a favor from any regime. The sovereign people must be the public, not the government." The NRM came to power promising to restore security and respect for human rights. This was part of the NRM's 10-point program, as Museveni noted in his swearing-in speech. "The second point on our program is security of person and property. Every person in Uganda must have absolute security to live wherever he wants. Any individual, any group who threatens the security of our people must be smashed without mercy. The people of Uganda should die only from natural causes which are beyond our control, but not from fellow human beings who continue to walk the length and breadth of our land." Although Museveni headed a new government in Kampala, the NRM could not project its influence fully across Ugandan territory, finding itself fighting a number of insurgencies. From the beginning of Museveni's presidency, he drew strong support from the Bantu-speaking South and Southwest, where Museveni had his base. Museveni managed to get the Karamohong, a group of semi-nomads in the sparsely populated northeast that had never had a significant political voice, to align with him by offering them a stake in the new government. The northern region along the Sudanese border, however, proved more troublesome. In the West Nile sub-region, the UNRF and Funa rebel groups fought for years until a combination of military offensives and diplomacy pacified the region. The leader of the UNRF, Moses Ali, gave up his struggle to become the second deputy prime minister. People from the northern parts of the country viewed the rise of a government led by a person from the south with great trepidation. Rebel groups sprang up among the Lango, Akoli, and Tizo peoples, though they were overwhelmed by the strength of the NRA except in the far north where the Sudanese border provided a safe haven. The Akoli rebel Uganda People's Democratic Army, UPDA, failed to dislodge the NRA occupation of Akoliland. The defeat of both the UPDA and HSM left the rebellion to a group that eventually became known as the Lord's Resistance Army, which turned upon the Akoli themselves. The NRA subsequently earned a reputation for respecting the rights of civilians, although Museveni later received criticism for using child soldiers. Undisciplined elements within the NRA soon tarnished a hard-won reputation for fairness. "When Museveni's men first came they acted very well, we welcomed them," said one villager, "but then they started to arrest people and kill them." In March 1989, Amnesty International published a human rights report on Uganda, the Human Rights Record 1986 to 1989. It documented gross human rights violations committed by NRA troops. According to Olara, a United Nations diplomat argued that Museveni pursued a genocide to Nilotic, Luo people living in the northern part of the country. In one of the most intense phases of the war, between October and December 1988, the NRA forcibly cleared approximately 100,000 people from their homes. Soldiers committed hundreds of extrajudicial executions as they forcibly moved people, burning down homes and granaries. In its conclusion, however, the report offered some hope. On September 13, 2019, Museveni's former Inspector General of Police, IGP, General Kale was placed on the United States Department of the Treasury sanctions list for gross violation of human rights during his reign. This was due to activities of the Uganda Police's Flying Squad unit that involved torture and corruption. Kale was subsequently replaced with Martin Okas. Elections. The first elections under Museveni's government were held on May 9, 1996. Museveni defeated Paul of the Democratic Party. Museveni won with 75.5% of the vote from a turnout of 72.6% of eligible voters. In 1997 he introduced free primary education. The second set of elections were held in 2001. Museveni got 69% of the vote to beat his rival Kizza Besigye. Besigye had been a close confidant of the president and was his physician during the Ugandan Bush War. They had a terrible fallout shortly before the 2001 elections, when Besigye decided to stand for the presidency. The 2001 election campaigns were a heated affair, with Museveni threatening to put his rival 6 feet under. International recognition. Museveni was elected chairperson of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1991 and 1992. Museveni's most widely noted accomplishment has been his government's successful campaign against AIDS. During the 1980s, Uganda had one of the highest rates of HIV infection in the world, but now Uganda's rates are comparatively low, and the country stands as a rare success story in the global battle against the virus. One of the campaigns headed by Museveni to fight against HIV/AIDS was the ABC program. The ABC program had 3 main parts: abstain, be faithful, or use condoms if A and B are not practiced. In April 1998, Uganda became the first country to be declared eligible for debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries (HIPC) initiative, receiving $700 million in aid. Museveni was lauded by some for his affirmative action program for women in the country. He had a female vice president, Kizibwe, for nearly a decade, and has done much to encourage women to go to college. On the other hand, Museveni has resisted calls for greater women's family land rights, the right of women to own a share of their matrimonial homes. The New York Times in 1997 said about Museveni, "These are heady days for the former guerrilla who runs Uganda. He moves with the measured gait and sure gestures of a leader secure in his power and his vision. It is little wonder to hear some of the diplomats and African experts tell it, President Yoweri Museveni started an ideological movement that is reshaping much of Africa, spelling the end of the corrupt, strongman governments that characterized the Cold War era. Some people now refer to him as Africa's other statesman, second only to the venerated South African President Nelson Mandela." In official briefing papers from Madeleine Albright's December 1997 Africa tour as Secretary of State, Museveni was claimed by the Clinton administration to be a beacon of hope who runs a uniparty democracy, despite Uganda not permitting multi-party politics. Museveni has been an important ally of the United States in the War on Terror. Regional conflict. First Congo War and Second Congo War. Following the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the new Rwandan government felt threatened by the presence across the Rwandan border in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, of former Rwandan soldiers and members of the previous regime. These soldiers were aided by Mobutu Sese Seko, leading Rwanda, with the aid of Museveni, and Laurent Kabila's rebels during the First Congo War to overthrow Mobutu and take power in the DRC. In August 1998, Rwanda and Uganda invaded the DRC again during the Second Congo War, this time to overthrow Kabila, who was a former ally of Museveni and Kagame. Museveni and a few close military advisors alone made the decision to send the Uganda People's Defense Force, UPDF, into the DRC. A number of highly placed sources indicate that the Ugandan parliament and civilian advisors were not consulted over the matter, as is required. The official reasons Uganda gave for the intervention were to stop a genocide against the Banyamulenge in the DRC in concert with Rwandan forces, and that Kabila had failed to provide security along the border and was allowing the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, to attack Uganda from bases in the DRC. In reality, the UPDF were deployed deep inside the DRC, more than 1,000 kilometers to the west of Uganda's border with the DRC. Troops from Rwanda and Uganda plundered the country's rich mineral deposits and timber. The United States responded to the invasion by suspending all military aid to Uganda, a disappointment to the Clinton administration, which had hoped to make Uganda the centerpiece of the African Crisis Response Initiative. In 2000, Rwandan and Ugandan troops exchanged fire on 3 occasions in the DRC city of Kisangani, leading to tensions and a deterioration in relations between Kagame and Museveni. The Ugandan government has also been criticized for aggravating the Ituri conflict, a sub-conflict of the Second Congo War. The Ugandan army officially withdrew from the Congo in 2003 and a contingent of UN peacekeepers was deployed. In December 2005, the International Court of Justice ruled that Uganda must pay compensation to the DRC for human rights violations during the Second Congo War. In 2001, Museveni won the presidential elections by a substantial majority, with his former friend and personal physician Kizza Besigye as the only real challenger. In a populist publicity stunt, a pentagenarian Museveni traveled on a Boda Boda motorcycle taxi to submit his nomination form for the election. Boda Boda is a cheap and somewhat dangerous, by Western standards, method of transporting passengers around towns and villages in East Africa. There was much recrimination and bitterness during the 2001 presidential elections campaign, and incidents of violence occurred following the announcement of the win by Museveni. Besigye challenged the election results in the Supreme Court of Uganda. 2 of the 5 judges concluded that there were such illegalities in the elections and that the results should be rejected. After the elections, political forces allied to Museveni began a campaign to loosen constitutional limits on the presidential term, allowing him to stand for election again in 2006. The 1995 Ugandan constitution provided for a 2-term limit on the tenure of the president. Museveni had previously stated that he considered the idea of clinging to office for 15 or more years ill-advised. Death of John Garang. On July 30, 2005, Sudanese Vice President John Garang was killed when the Ugandan presidential helicopter crashed while he was flying back to Sudan from talks in Uganda. Garang had been Sudan's vice president for 3 weeks before his death. Widespread speculation as to the cause of the crash led Museveni, on August 10, to threaten the closure of media outlets that published conspiracy theories about Garang's death. In a statement, Museveni claimed that the speculation was a threat to national security. "I will no longer tolerate a newspaper which is like a vulture." In 2007, Museveni deployed troops to the African Union's peacekeeping operation in Somalia. Also in this term, Museveni held meetings with investors that included Wisdec, to promote Uganda's call center and outsourcing industry and create employment to the country. In September 2009 Museveni refused Kabaka, the Buganda King, permission to visit some areas of the Buganda Kingdom. Riots occurred and over 40 people were killed while others were imprisoned. Furthermore, 9 more people were killed during the April 2011 walk-to-work demonstrations. Fundamentalist Christianity. In 2009, MSNBC channel reported investigation regarding ties between Museveni and the American fundamentalist Christian organization, identified Museveni as the organization's key man in Africa. LGBT rights. Further international scrutiny accompanied the 2009 Ugandan efforts to institute the death penalty for homosexuality, with British, Canadian, French, and American leaders expressing concerns for human rights. In 2023, Museveni signed an anti-LGBTQ+ bill and called on other African leaders to reject the promotion of homosexuality. In October 2022 Museveni apologized to Kenya on behalf of his son, Muhoozi, who tweeted that he could invade Kenya in 2 weeks. In July 2023, Museveni attended the 2023 Russia, Africa Summit in St. Petersburg and met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Without specifically mentioning the Russian invasion of Ukraine or any other war, Museveni said that the only justified wars are the just wars, like the anti-colonial wars. Wars of hegemony will fail and waste time and opportunity. Dialogue is the correct way. After the Hamas attack on Israel in October 2023, Museveni expressed concern over the situation and called for dialogue and a 2-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Subscribe to our channel for more of this.